May 12, 1945. Camp Co., Mississippi. German women prisoners marched into the mess hall expecting scraps of bread and watery soup. Instead, they froze in disbelief. Piles of fried chicken, steaming vegetables, and a strange yellow square they instantly mocked. Cornbread. In Germany, corn was for pigs. Here, Americans ate it like cake. The women laughed, until the first brave one took a bite. What happened next turned their laughter into silence, and then into something no one expected. This is the forgotten story of how a simple loaf of cornbread broke down walls stronger than barbed wire. Stay with us to the end, and if you love untold World War II stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel so we can bring you more history that textbooks leave out. May 12, 1945. The gates of Camp Co clanged shut on a convoy of army trucks, each carrying women who had once worn the eagle insignia of Hitler's Reich. Some had been radio operators, others trained bakers, factory forewomen, or clerks in Wehrmacht offices. Now they were prisoners, marched under the watchful eyes of American guards into a world they had only known through the distorted lens of Nazi propaganda. For years they had been told America was a land of weak stomachs and mechanical clumsiness. A country too obsessed with jazz, chewing gum, and excess to fight with discipline. Yet on that first morning, the contradiction hit them in the form of food. The mess hall was already alive, clattering trays, shouted orders, and the thick, buttery aroma of a southern breakfast that drifted out of the steaming kitchen. Most striking of all were the portions. Eggs, fried chicken, potatoes swimming in gravy, and beside them, a curious yellow wedge set on every tray. Its smell was faintly sweet, its texture coarse yet airy, nothing like the dense rye loaves they knew. To German eyes it looked suspiciously like fodder, a farmer's trick to stretch animal feed into something edible. "They give us pig bread," one prisoner muttered, earning a ripple of laughter across the benches. Corn in Germany had long been reserved for livestock. Even in Berlin's bakeries, cornmeal was a rarity, a filler for desperate times, not a staple of human dining. Now, to be served it by a nation that claimed victory, and in such lavish abundance, felt like mockery. But the irony was sharp. While the women whispered insults and jokes, their stomachs growled. Germany was in ruins, and back home their families survived on rations that had dwindled to less than 1,200 calories a day. The Reich food estate, once boasting of feeding millions, had collapsed under Allied bombing and territorial loss. In Seat 8. On trust, America in 1945 produced nearly 3.2 billion bushels of corn annually, a number so large it eclipsed the entire German grain harvest. The imbalance was visible on every plate. Ilse Schneider, a 30-year-old from Berlin, who had apprenticed in a bakery before the war, pushed her tray forward and sniffed the bread. "Coarse," she pronounced. "Animal feed, baked with arrogance." The others chuckled, echoing her verdict. Yet even as she dismissed it, she noticed something unnerving. The Americans were not laughing back. They served the bread with a kind of pride, as though this humble square was as valuable as the meat beside it. That first day, most of the cornbread went untouched. Some of the braver women crumbled it into their potatoes to mask the taste, while others discarded it altogether. The guards noticed, but they didn't force compliance. Instead, they simply returned the next day with more trays, more squares, more butter to spread across them. The message was unspoken but clear. The abundance was not a trick, not a temporary gesture. This was the American baseline. At night in their barracks, the women replayed the meal. Some laughed again, dismissing it as proof of American simplicity. Others, quieter now, admitted the smell of butter had tempted them. Hunger gnawed more fiercely when memories of German breadlines crept in. It was the paradox of captivity in America. Prisoners surrounded by freedoms of taste and variety that their own people, even in victory, had never enjoyed. One young prisoner later recalled in her memoir, "We came as enemies, yet we ate better in 1 week than my family did in the last year of war." It was humiliating. It was also a relief. For now, though, the ridicule held sway. Cornbread was a symbol of otherness, and mocking it was a way to preserve dignity. But dignity bends under hunger. In the days to come, curiosity would creep in, silent as the smell of warm bread rising from the camp ovens. What began as scorn in the mess hall would soon turn into whispers of confession, women who dared to try the pig bread in secret. And those whispers would spread. By the third day at Camp Co, the cornbread had become both a joke and a test. At the long wooden tables, German voices echoed in sarcastic chorus. "Schweinebrot," they sang, pig bread, lifting the yellow wedges high in mock toasts before tossing them back onto their trays. The laughter was loud, even defiant. Mockery was their armor. a way to cling to superiority in the face of captivity. But hunger is patient, and it does not care about pride. At night, the women lay on iron bunks, the thin army blankets pulled tight, and the smell of the day's meal lingered in memory. Some admitted to themselves what they would not say aloud. The bread had not smelled bad at all. In fact, it had carried a warmth that was strangely inviting, a sweetness foreign to the sour tang of rye they had grown up on. The first to break ranks were the youngest. One 19-year-old signals clerk, Erica Meyer, slipped her square of cornbread into her pocket during lunch and pretended to throw it away. Later that evening, when the others were distracted by letters from home, she nibbled it slowly in the corner of the barracks. It was dry, she would later recall in an interview. But it was not pig food. It was like a cake, strange, but not bad. I was ashamed to want more. The irony sharpened with each passing day. While the women sneered, the camp guards ate the same meals without hesitation. Cornbread was not a punishment ration, but part of their own diet. It appeared on American tables from Mississippi to Kansas, a staple of families who had never known bread queues or ration stamps. One corporal, overhearing the prisoners' derision, shrugged and told them, "Back home, my mama won't cook a meal without it." The women exchanged disbelieving glances. Could it be true that an entire nation of free people willingly ate what Germans fed to pigs? Statistics gave weight to the paradox. In wartime Germany, average bread rations for civilians had fallen to 200 grams per day, often stretched with fillers like barley, potato starch, even sawdust. By 1945, some German towns reported flour shortages so severe that bakeries closed for weeks. Meanwhile, the United States had not only fed its own population, but shipped more than 20 million tons of food aid to Allied nations. To a German prisoner, the disparity was incomprehensible, a gap as wide as the Atlantic itself. Mockery began to crack. A few women started crumbling the cornbread discreetly into soup, softening its texture. Others, when guards weren't watching, traded for butter to smear across its top. Hunger worked like water against stone, slowly, relentlessly, reshaping their convictions. One afternoon, Ilse Schneider herself caught Erica with a crumb in her hand. The older woman, proud of her Berlin bakery training, raised an eyebrow. Erica blushed, but she did not deny it. "It isn't so terrible," she whispered. "You only have to chew it differently." Ilse turned away, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The barracks buzzed with quiet admissions. "I tried it yesterday. With honey, it is almost like cake. It fills the stomach better than potatoes." These confessions spread like contraband, shame mixed with curiosity. It was as if each square of cornbread had become a dare, a wedge of yellow rebellion against their own prejudices. And then came the subtle shift in mood. Laughter at the mess tables grew quieter, less certain. Some women still lifted their portions theatrically in mock salute, but others held them longer before setting them down. The lines were forming, those who clung to pride and those who allowed their acts and their senses to make new judgments. One diary fragment captured the moment of surrender. "I laughed with them, but later I ate alone. I chewed slowly. It was strange, but I wanted more. The shame was worse than the taste." Soon, the ridicule would give way to something more profound. For one woman in particular, curiosity would no longer be satisfied by stolen bites. She would step into the kitchen itself, and what she saw there would change her judgment forever. By the end of May, the cornbread was no longer a joke. It was a mystery. The prisoners had mocked it, then tasted it, and now they began to ask, why? Why would Americans, with their overwhelming industrial power and vast farmlands, make corn the centerpiece of their meals? To German minds, wheat and rye had always been the grains of civilization. Corn was coarse, animal feed, useful for fattening pigs or bulking up bread in times of famine. And yet, here in Mississippi, it appeared daily, not as a compromise, but as a tradition. To understand the paradox, the women needed context they had never been taught. America in 1945 was producing food on a scale that dwarfed Europe. The US harvested nearly 80 million acres of corn each year, yielding billions of bushels that fed not only Americans, but also soldiers overseas, and even allies abroad. Wheat was plentiful, but corn had been the grain of the New World since the first Native American harvests centuries earlier. In the South especially, cornbread was more than sustenance. It was identity, served at breakfast with molasses, at dinner with beans, at supper beside fried chicken. The German women could not know this yet, but history flavored every bite. Native tribes had once shown European settlers how to grind maize into meal, mix it with water and salt, and bake it on hot stones or iron skillets. Over generations, cornbread had evolved: buttermilk for tang, eggs for richness, cast iron, pans for crisp edges. To Southerners, it was no more peasant food than rye bread was to Germans. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of plenty in a land where fields rolled endlessly to the horizon. The prisoners, however, framed it differently. Ilse Schneider scoffed one morning. "They could give us wheat, but they give us this. Is this supposed to humiliate us?" Her tone was sharp, but beneath it lay a note of unease. For if cornbread was humiliation, why did the guards eat it with such casual joy? Why did they smear it with butter, drizzle it with sorghum, laugh around tables where no one went hungry? Here was the deeper irony. What the Germans thought was an insult was in fact an invitation into American daily life. The abundance was not staged for their benefit. It was ordinary reality. This wasn't propaganda. It was routine. Sensory memory deepened the lesson. The coarse texture crumbled on the tongue, unlike the chew of rye. Its aroma, slightly sweet, lingered in the air longer than the boiled potatoes beside it. Paired with beans or honey, it carried flavors unknown in Northern Europe. For women who had grown up in the shadows of ration cards and the Reich's control of grain markets, cornbread was shocking proof that America was not suffering. While Berlin starved under rubble, Mississippi overflowed with grain. The guards sometimes joked lightly with them, sensing the cultural clash. "You don't know good bread when you see it," one cook teased. Another offered molasses on the side, saying, "Try it this way, like my grandmother did." The gestures were small, but they eroded barriers. The food was not just nourishment. It was a language, one the Germans were slowly learning to translate. One young prisoner noted in her diary, "We mocked it as pig food, but to them it is home. I do not understand it, but I see it makes them proud." And pride mattered. Cornbread carried the pride of a nation that had never known famine on German terms. It was simple, rustic, even coarse, but it was never desperate. To mock it was to miss its meaning. Soon the prisoners would be forced to confront that meaning more directly, for into this growing curiosity stepped a woman who would change the narrative, Sergeant Dorothy Wells, head of the camp kitchen. With a simple invitation, she would draw Ilse into the very heart of American cooking. And there, behind the stoves, the German baker's certainty would begin to crumble like the cornbread itself. The invitation came unexpectedly. One humid morning in June, as the prisoners filed out of the mess hall, a stocky woman in a flour-dusted apron beckoned to one of the guards. A few words were exchanged, a nod given. Then the guard pointed directly at Ilse Schneider. Ilse stiffened. For weeks she had been the loudest critic of cornbread, a voice of Berlin bakery pride among her fellow captives. Now the camp's chief cook, Sergeant Dorothy Wells, wanted to see her. At first Ilse assumed it was punishment. Perhaps they had grown tired of her sharp tongue. But when she was escorted through the swinging doors into the kitchen, the truth startled her. The room pulsed with activity. Giant mixers churned, iron skillets hissed on open burners, and the smell of yeast and butter filled the air. Compared to the bomb-scarred bakeries of Berlin, this was another world. Shelves were stacked with sacks of flour and cornmeal, tins of baking powder, canisters of sugar. Where Germans in 1945 were surviving on meager rations, sometimes less than 1,000 calories per day, the Americans seemed to live in an empire of plenty. Sergeant Wells, wiping her hands on her apron, gave a half smile. "You're the baker, aren't you? Thought you might want to see how we do things here." Her voice was firm, without condescension. Ilse glanced at the counter. There it was, a bowl of yellow batter flecked with cornmeal, thick but pourable. Next to it, a skillet slicked with bacon grease, heating until white. SPS of smoke curled upward. The sergeant poured the batter in one smooth motion. The sizzle filled the room, followed by a smell unlike anything Ilse knew, earthy, sweet, and savory at once. The edges crisped almost instantly, forming a golden crust. Wells tapped the handle with practiced ease and said, "Cornbread's about timing. Too hot and it burns. Too cool and it goes heavy. Balance, that's the trick." Ilse leaned closer despite herself. She noticed the care in each motion, the exact angle of the skillet, the way the cook tested the heat with a flick of water droplets. It was not clumsy improvisation. It was craft. For the first time, her prejudice wavered. She remembered how, in Berlin, she had studied the texture of rye dough, the shine on a perfect crust. Watching Wells work, she saw the same devotion, just applied to another grain. Wells cut the finished cornbread into wedges, steam rising as she set one piece on a plate. "Go on," she said simply. Ilse hesitated. To accept was to risk ridicule from her peers, to cross an invisible line between mockery and respect. But the smell was too strong, the hunger too deep. She broke off a piece and placed it on her tongue. The texture surprised her, coarse but not unpleasant. The crust crunchy, while the inside remained moist. Butter melted into the crumb, releasing a richness that coated her mouth. It was not rye, not wheat, not anything she knew, yet it was undeniably bread. Real bread. She swallowed slowly, then looked up. "It is not pig food," she admitted quietly. Wells raised an eyebrow. "Never was." That simple exchange marked a turning point. For Ilsa, the cornbread was no longer a symbol of humiliation, but of revelation. The Americans had not served it out of contempt, they had served it out of tradition. Later that evening, when she returned to the barracks, the women pressed her for details. "What did you see? What did it taste like?" Her answers were cautious at first, but her authority as a trained baker gave her words weight. "It is made with skill," she told them. "It is coarse, but there is pride in it." The paradox deepened. A woman who once sneered now spoke with respect, and that respect began to spread. The kitchen had become more than a place of cooking. It was now a classroom, a battleground of perception. And soon, Ilsa would return there not as a skeptic, but as a student. The next morning, word spread through the barracks like fire. Ilsa ate it. The women who had once followed her in laughter now crowded her bunk with questions. Was it true? Was American cornbread really fit for human mouths? Ilsa, once so scornful, now held herself differently. She admitted with the authority of a master baker that while cornbread was no rye, it had its own merits. "It is coarse," she said, "but not crude. There is skill in the way they bake it." The statement shook the group. For weeks, pride had been their shield. Now, one of their own, a Berliner trained in the old guild methods, had surrendered her certainty. A few days later, Sergeant Wells invited her back into the kitchen. This time, Ilsa was not alone. Erika Meyer, the young clerk who had first dared to eat in secret, joined her. The two women stood side by side as American cooks moved with practiced rhythm, preparing trays of golden loaves. The kitchen was hot, filled with the hiss of grease and the thud of knives on cutting boards. The smell of butter, onions, and frying meat hung thick in the air. Ilsa's hands itched to work. When Wells offered her a mixing bowl, she accepted. Cornmeal, flour, eggs, buttermilk. Ingredients so plentiful here, so scarce in Germany, were poured without ration stamp or substitutes. Ilsa stirred carefully, adjusting texture, judging by sight and feel. When she poured her batter into the skillet, she found herself holding her breath. Minutes later, she pulled it from the oven. The loaf was golden, the crust cracked in familiar patterns of heat. She cut a wedge, offered it to Erika, then tasted a piece herself. The flavor was rich, even comforting. Not rye, not wheat, but honest, nourishing. When she stepped out of the kitchen that day, she carried more than food. She carried a confession. That evening, at the long mess table, Ilsa rose and spoke clearly enough for the whole barracks to hear. "I was wrong. It is not food for pigs. It is bread. Different, but bread." The room fell silent. Some scoffed, others looked away. But a few nodded, relief flickering across their faces. They too had been tasting in secret. Now they had permission to admit it. A strange thing followed. The ridicule of cornbread lessened. Instead, prisoners began experimenting, crumbling it into beans, drizzling it with sorghum syrup, softening it with milk. What had begun as an object of mockery was becoming part of their daily lives. The paradox was sharp. German women, raised in the pride of old-world baking, now found themselves converted by the coarse bread of the American South. It was humbling, but also liberating. For the first time since capture, they were not just prisoners consuming rations. They were participants in another culture's table. Numbers underscored the truth. The United States military was feeding nearly 2 million prisoners of war on American soil in 1945. Camps like Co served meals that cost the government only about $1 per prisoner per day. Yet the variety and abundance were astonishing compared to Europe's famine diet. Cornbread, cheap to produce and deeply tied to American heritage, was the perfect staple. Ilsa would late us. A recall. "It was the first time I admitted that our judgments of America were wrong. Bread, I thought, was proof of culture. I was forced to see there were other proofs, just as valid. What had begun with a single bite was spreading like yeast through dough, transforming not just meals but mindsets. And soon, the exchange would grow even larger. The kitchen would not remain only American territory. It would become a space of collaboration, where rye and corn met side by side, producing recipes that symbolized something far greater than food. By midsummer, the cornbread was no longer a curiosity. It had become a quiet ritual in the camp. Trays sliding down the mess line, women breaking off wedges, The first bite always followed by a small pause, as if their tongues still half expected the humiliation of animal feed. But instead came warmth, salt, butter, and a comfort that no one had anticipated. It was then that Sergeant Wells made her boldest move. One afternoon she asked Ilse if she would be willing to teach the American cooks a German recipe. The suggestion stunned the barracks. To share their bread with the enemy, wasn't that betrayal? Yet Ilse considered it. The Americans had not mocked her when she confessed her change of heart. They had welcomed her into their kitchen, given her tools, trusted her hands. Perhaps, she reasoned, it was time to return the gesture. She chose rye bread, not the dark, dense loaves of scarcity that wartime Berliners had endured, but the proud, sturdy rye of her apprenticeship days. Bread that could last a week, bread that carried the smell of caraway and the taste of patience. She taught the camp cooks to grind seeds, to proof the sponge overnight, to fold the dough with the heel of the hand. The Americans, used to speed and abundance, found the process almost ceremonial. When the first loaf emerged from the oven, the smell filled the mess hall. Even the guards paused, nostrils flaring. The German women leaned forward as slices were cut, their hearts tugged by the memory of home. Some cried openly when he tasted it, not just for the bread, but for the fleeting return of a world that seemed lost. From that day, the kitchen was transformed. On some mornings, the ovens produced cornbread. On others, rye. And sometimes, in an innovation no recipe book had foreseen, the two were blended. Ilse experimented with mixtures of rye and cornmeal, combining sourdough tang with southern sweetness. The results were uneven at first, but gradually, a hybrid loaf emerged. It was not German, it was not American, it was something new. The symbolism did not escape anyone. Bread had always been more than food. It was identity, memory, even politics. In this camp in Mississippi, bread became a truce. Numbers reflected the quiet revolution. By the end of 1945, more than 375,000 German prisoners were living in U.S. camps across 46 states. While not all experienced cultural exchange as intimate as Camp Coe's kitchen, thousands did work in agriculture, kitchens, and factories. Places where daily contact softened the sharp edges of enmity. For Ilse and her companions, the kitchen became more than labor. It was a classroom, a proving ground, a sanctuary. Younger women who had never baked before learned side by side with American cooks. Guards tasted new loaves without suspicion. Recipes were written down, passed across the language barrier, tucked away like contraband of a different kind. Not weapons, but knowledge. Cornbread had been mocked, then accepted, then fused with rye into something greater. What began as survival food had become the language of reconciliation. And soon, that language would spill beyond the mess hall, into the fields, the towns, and the uneasy encounters with American civilians who did not always welcome the sight of former enemies on their land. By late summer, the gates of Camp Coe no longer marked the limits of experience for the German women. Trucks rattled out each morning, carrying groups of prisoners into the Mississippi countryside to work on farms. The war was over, but America still needed hands. Cotton to pick, wheat to thresh, and fields to tend, while young American men remained overseas or only just returning home. Fields told a different story. For the women, farm work became more than labor. It was a lesson in contrasts, scarcity versus abundance, suspicion versus gradual trust. We realized we were not hated for who we were, Ilse later wrote, but for what we represented. And the only way to change that was not with words, but with work and with bread. As summer waned, the women returned each evening to the camp mess hall, their skin darkened by the sun, their muscles aching but their spirits strangely lighter. They carried with them not just fatigue, but the memory of harvests. Cotton fields glowing pink in dusk, cornbread shared under shade trees, American children watching them not as monsters, but as women. The farm gates closed behind them each night, but the world beyond was already shifting. They had arrived as prisoners. They were becoming participants. And soon, they would leave as something stranger says, till students of a nation they had been taught to despise. Autumn came, and with it the first notices of repatriation. Some of the German women wept with relief. Others dreaded what awaited them in the ruins of Berlin, Hamburg, or Dresden. Word trickled in from Red Cross parcels and letters. Homes bombed, families scattered, cities hollowed out. America's abundance seemed like a fever dream they would soon awaken from. Yet the legacy of their captivity had already taken root. What had begun as mockery of cornbread had become something far larger. Ilse's hybrid loaves were still being baked daily, a blend of rye and corn that symbolized the unlikely union of two food cultures born from war. Guards took recipes home to their wives. Farmers remembered the POW crews who had labored in their fields, not with malice, but with diligence. Children who had tasted the prisoners' bread would recall it years later. The paradox endured. They had come as prisoners, yet they left as teachers. What propaganda had claimed, that America was decadent, disorganized and weak, had been dismantled not by lectures, but by meals, by the taste of butter, by the laughter around a mess hall table, by loaves that proved bread could be both survival and reconciliation. When Ilse finally returned to Berlin in 1946, she found her family scattered and her neighborhood unrecognizable. Yet she carried with her a notebook of recipes, scribbled half in German, half in English. In the following years, she opened a small bakery where Berliners queued not just for rye but for something strange and new. Maisbrot, cornbread, warm and golden. The shop became known as a place of curiosity, then of comfort. Eventually, American soldiers stationed in Berlin came to buy bread there, smiling as if they recognized a piece of home. Her story was not unique. Across Germany, at first, the sight of German women in khaki work clothes shocked the locals. Some farmers stared in silence, others turned away with clenched jaws. Too many sons had not come back from Normandy, Anzio, or the Ardennes. To see their killers' compatriots now laughing in the fields, bending over rows of corn or cotton, felt unbearable. And yet, the paradox deepened. Those same farmers who scowled at the sight of POWs in their fields also watched, astonished, as the yields rose. With nearly 425,000 prisoners of war employed nationwide in 1945, Mississippi alone gained thousands of laborers. That year, U.S. Department of Agriculture reports showed record surpluses, more than 2.7 billion bushels of corn harvested, and nearly 14 million bales of cotton. German hands helped make it possible. The women adapted quickly. They had grown up in a Germany where ration bread contained sawdust, where potatoes were stretched beyond recognition, where calories dwindled with every month of the war. Here, under the vast southern sky, the soil itself seemed to shout abundance. It felt as if everything would grow, remembered prisoner Helga Kraus. Corn as tall as a house, cotton like snow on endless fields. We thought we had entered another world, but the generosity of nature did not erase the bitterness of grief. One farmer's wife refused to let the Germans drink from her well. Another instructed her children never to speak to the prisoners. The women bore it in silence, their heads lowered, the sting of rejection sharper than the summer sun. They understood. They were not just foreigners. They were reminders of empty chairs at American tables. And yet, moments of breakthrough came. On one farm, Ilse carried a small loaf of the rye-corn hybrid bread she had baked the night before. During a break, she offered a piece to the farmer's daughter, a girl no older than 12. The child hesitated, then tasted. Her eyes widened, and she smiled. That small gesture, recorded in a guard's report, softened the family's stance. By the next week, the farmer's wife brought out jars of sweet tea for the work crew. This slow thawing mirrored the larger paradox of POW life in America. Officially, the Geneva Convention guaranteed humane treatment. But in practice, America went further. Full meals, fair work, even wages paid in camp scrip redeemable at the canteen. German propaganda had painted the United States as chaotic, violent and weak. The daily reality of Mississippi for POWs carried home similar paradoxes. Tales of steak dinners when they had expected starvation, of baseball games when they had expected beatings, of cornbread when they had expected animal feed. They had come to America as enemies and left as witnesses to its contradictions. And in the broader sweep of history, those contradictions mattered. In the ruins of war, bread had been more powerful than any weapon. Abundance had disarmed bitterness. Dignity had replaced cruelty. America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its capacity to share what it had in excess. They asked every day, remembered one guard years later, cornbread or rye today? They laughed at it at first. But by the end, it was all they wanted. The women who once sneered at golden loaves now baked them for their children. What had begun as suspicion ended as sustenance. What had begun as captivity ended as connection. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. And in the end, the lesson was simple. Bread, broken and shared, can bridge even the deepest divides.